have more tax, right? We are getting it.
State sovereignty is the most important thing to be able to secure the rights of individuals. And in order to do this, it must ensure its survival through the continuous supply of its people that make sure that states function properly and that institutions continue to work. That's why states in most liberal democracies engage in activities that encourage childbirth, for example, giving tax breaks. We think this is just a natural extension of those policies, and we would argue in opening government that is a good thing for these states. What are the states that we are talking about, ladies and gentlemen? Oftentimes, these are states with low population and aging populations. These are states with the highly educated who do not wish to have children because of financial stability and opportunity costs involved with having children. Oftentimes, this could involve as well things like the lower to middle income class not willing to engage in these types of activities. Most of the time, these are states as well where education is widely accessible, meaning that they do have a choice, ladies and gentlemen, to be able to choose whether or not to have children or not. And information about childbirth is generally available to them, and the safety and risks of having sex, of course, is also part of that educational system. I want to talk about so the policy of incentivizing, ladies and gentlemen, is pretty straightforward. We would increase the tax benefits if it is applicable. We would increase financial subsidies if they need to be able to pay for groceries, for example, from basic necessities such as groceries, extending to other things like financial subsidies to get more trips abroad, or the state could do this to be able to incentivize this activity, right? But also we would like to extend maternal and paternal benefits. So companies, for example, can be encouraged to hire women who have had children, for example, so that they have more incentive to actually hire women. I'll take your point later. Encouraged to be able to hire women who have had children, ladies and gentlemen. Of course, this policy could also apply to, ladies and gentlemen, extending to individuals who want to adopt or have surrogate families. I think the policy generally wants to encourage having better families, and we think as an extension of that, adopting and having surrogate families is good. I want to talk about three things in this speech. I'll take your point in a minute, right? I'll talk about why the highly educated is something that the state has to be interested in, especially in terms of rearing families. I want to talk about why the incentives will work towards the highly educated, and I'll talk about the different types of people in society today. But I'll also talk about the rights of states to shape behavior. Before that, yes.
When the motion says this has to live, the state should do this, you don't get the right to limit it to specific countries. It has specific population growth problem.
Yeah, again, like, I think we're speaking in generalities here. Most of the time, the incentives of states who want to do this are countries with aging populations. Of course, if states want to do this in countries that have no aging populations, we're welcome to do that. It still supports the principle of state sovereignty and the ability of individuals to ensure the state's survival continuously. I want to talk about why highly educated people are particularly important, ladies and gentlemen. Because highly educated people not only have stable sources of income, because they can provide for not just general education, but also higher education, but also the opportunities to them are generally more open, ladies and gentlemen. Meaning that there are bigger returns to the state when they invest in highly educated individuals. We think that high education is also a proxy indicator that they can take care of better families, right? As I've told you, wealth and financial stability often gets us many opportunities, ladies and gentlemen, because high education is correlated to the ability of these individuals to participate in the labor force. But also we think they make better political choices, notwithstanding that they can make conservative choices, but at least those choices are academic, ladies and gentlemen, and they can make better choices for the state. But most important of all is that they can rear children better, right? Because we think that high education is also correlated to a level of intellectual engagement, and they are knowledgeable of some parental techniques, and they pass down multiple knowledge and ability to be educated to have a better legacy down to their children. So we think in the comparative, families that are highly educated can rear children better because of the environment that they are able to provide and the choices that they are better able to make in society. Why will this work? Sit down. Why will this policy work in terms of incentivizing highly educated people to have children? Because no, recognize, ladies and gentlemen, that there are burdens to rearing children, right? The opportunity cost of having children, especially to women, are particularly high, right? They are sacrificing almost 3 months to a year, ladies and gentlemen, of not being able to work. And along with this are actual financial costs involved in raising that child. Furthermore, we think in most of these societies where the highly educated do not choose to have children, oftentimes the tradition and the culture don't exist to them, or that these traditions or cultures that are already weak in their minds, ladies and gentlemen. Meaning that they can combat traditional reasons for having children. So why will these incentives work, ladies and gentlemen? We think these incentives will work because especially to the types of people who want to have children but consider the actual opportunity cost. We say that the highly educated oftentimes feel the discrimination towards having children, ladies and gentlemen. So these individuals are stuck in the middle, right? They want to be able to fully actualize the choice of having children and the happiness involved with that, but realize the discrimination and the opportunity cost involved. We think this policy addresses that because this gives them an opportunity to actualize a form of happiness while at the same time being incentivized to actually continue to work and be able to pursue a career that is actually happy, that actually fulfills them as well, ladies and gentlemen. Because it caters to the most basic needs in the Maslow's hierarchy of needs. These are the more humanitarian needs, ladies and gentlemen. But to people in the middle, ladies and gentlemen, people who are not sure whether to make this choice, we think the state provides a natural discourse for them because they can choose what choices are better for them or not. So people in the middle could be given an incentive to actually consider that having children is actually beneficial for them. But thirdly, to those who do not want to have children, in either model, they won't have children anyway. The state does not force them to actually have children since this policy only encourages them to have to do so, right? But to finish off on this speech, why do the states have the right to shape behavior? In majority of liberal countries, states can choose, for example, specific fields of study in terms of prioritizing research, for example, or that they can set standards of what defines citizenship. And in most liberal countries, as I've told you, already extend benefits to families, right? Why do we think that the states have the right to shape behavior? It's precisely because in order to secure the survival of the state, it must continue to engage in activities that propagate its population and ensure that some people will protect and defend the types of rights and continue to participate in political institutions. We on Opening Government believe that rearing children shouldn't be a hard choice, and we think that these incentives will work in order to ensure our survival. Thank you.
It's worth noting the majority of side propositions' argumentation is an argument for child benefits and support for parents, not support for this specific policy. Let's be very clear about what we stand for in opposition. We stand for a generous state which provides support for those who want to have children ensures they can do so. But rather than focusing that state on those who are already most privileged, who already have access to resources, what we favor in opposition is investment in those who don't have the techniques of parenting so that give them the opportunity to learn them. Investment in early start centers so children can have high quality daycare, the thing most correlated with improving life outcomes in children from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, and educating parents and giving them more choices. Fundamentally, side proposition invests their money where they're going to get the least bang for their buck, i.e. in parents who are already wealthy, where it takes an enormous amount of money to make any difference to the life of a child or to create an educated child. By contrast, for the same amount of money, we can make an enormous difference to children from disproportionately underprivileged backgrounds and massively increase their life outcomes and therefore all the benefits to the state they described and assumed. So, firstly, responses to highly educated parents. They say it's a good proxy indicator for education is a good proxy indicator for intelligence being a good parent. We would say actually it's probably just a good proxy indicator of your level of inherited privilege. Note, they try and set this in Scandinavia or other countries with high levels of access to education. This is not a legitimate application of their model. This has to be set globally as by the rules of the competition, and therefore we have many countries with very high levels of educational inequality where education merely reflects reflect what you're stuck in rather than whether you are going to be a good parent or whether you're intelligent. Secondly, they said that you're going to rear better children because you have a high level of intellectual engagement. I think the thing to note is the things they describe which are good for children are fairly simple. Things like reading for them or getting them to read themselves. That does not require you to have a degree yourself. It just requires you to be aware that that is something which is good for your children, to make the effort in order to make them do that. We think we can equip people with that knowledge without having to have them, they themselves have gone to university. Finally, they say that people are deterred by the costs of having children. So firstly, the costs of having children are higher for those who are more educated because the cost trade-off in terms of their career is more expensive. So if they want to incentivize a higher birth rate, as much of their analysis appeared to imply, they can do that more effectively by focusing these resources on those who are less privileged. Secondly, we think it's precisely because of the fact there is this deterrent effect, this policy is so dramatically expensive, which is why there's such a huge trade-off against policies which can actually be effective in terms of targeting resources on children. So, firstly, why we think this policy is dramatically less effective than alternative uses of these resources. We would note that whilst in debating we tend to treat all resources as infinite, the reality is there are limited resources available, and specifically limited resources available for spending on a particular area of policy, for example, education or child welfare. And we can see this because most states currently so dramatically underinvest in the early life of children and early childcare, because children aren't an enfranchised group and therefore they don't have political influence. 3 reasons why we think this is going to consume a dramatic proportion of the budget allocated for this area. Firstly, educated people have lots of money. Therefore, swaying the incentives of them in a particular direction is disproportionately likely to be wildly expensive. Secondly, because it's a huge decision, and therefore the level of subsidy you're going to offer people is going to have to be very significant in order to get any degree of change. And finally, because of all the reasons side proposition tell us about why having children is in itself specifically very expensive, all that analysis demonstrates why this has to be a high level of subsidy in order to encourage people to do this. What does that mean? That means there are huge trade-offs with other spending areas and other spending commitments. Spending on things like lifting poor people out of poverty, or meaning that impoverished children can see their parents because they're not having to work 2 jobs, things which will firstly make a much greater material difference to the average intelligence, the average educational attainment of the population, because having a parent to come home to for hundreds of children makes a greater difference than creating 1 or 2 more children of highly educated people. But secondly, we think it is fundamentally unethical for the state to spend its money in this ineffective way trying to create a super race when it could be trying to lift those people out of poverty much more effectively. Secondly, this is an ineffective and poor proxy for eugenics. As previously observed, education best reflects inherited privilege rather than your fundamental level of intelligence in most societies. And that is because there are high barriers to access of education, which means that even if you are highly intelligent, if you don't go to a good school, if you don't have the right tutors, you're probably not going to get into the best universities, or you won't be able to pay the fees to be when you're there unless you're very lucky and you manage to win a scholarship or you're exceptionally intelligent. That means that in the majority of cases, this isn't perpetuating brilliance, but it's perpetuating it's perpetuating people who just already have access to education. I'll take closing if you have one. By contrast, we can invest in finding people who are actually brilliant and targeting resources at them. Go for it.
Do you believe that the state has a moral imperative to provide education, financial security, and other basic rights to as many children as possible?
Yes, we do. We think this is an ineffective way of doing so because it sucks up money which could be spent on that. No, by contrast, but we could spend the money on scholarships, we could spend the money on other ways of luring people from lower income backgrounds into a university or education, which they're not going to do so on side proposition. Thirdly, in terms of parental commitment, we note the greatest correlation with success of a child is not whether your parents have gone to university, but firstly whether your parents adopt the correct techniques, i.e. things like not subjecting you to corporal punishment, things like reading to you at night, things like encouraging you to be intellectually interested, and secondly, whether they are personally emotionally committed to you in terms of giving you unconditional love and attention, etc. Note, neither of these things are things which need you to be super educated, although they can in some circumstances be correlated with education. What they're more correlated with is whether your parents are highly committed to you and your personal intellectual development. We think they're much less likely to be super committed if they have were uncertain about whether they wanted to have children, but were incentivized in a way because they thought they could trade it off against their career plan. Side proposition present it as, but it's just someone who had children anyway, but didn't feel they would be able to when we're giving them slightly more money. We think in reality, this looks like giving women significantly greater pay for having children than they would get at a company, such that patriarchal members of their family can incentivize or encourage them in order to have children, and they're not facing the life choices they want. Or it looks like people who were never quite sure if they wanted to have children, thought they would be a bad parent, but were nudged in that direction, end up regretting it later. That means that any of the benefits you get from having more educated parents are traded off because those parents are less committed, and will be better off to spend that money on ensuring that genuinely committed parents know how to manifest their commitment in the most effective possible way. This motion is profoundly ineffective, and it results therefore in a worse educated population very proud to oppose.
Essentially, the only argumentation coming from opposition, well, most of the argumentation coming from them is all about money. The fact that we would rather pull in money into poverty alleviation, which I think is a false comparative in this debate because number one, it presumes that the only way to fund this particular policy is to take money from poverty alleviation programs, which won't happen in majority of states because even in third world countries, all these states have a political interest to always keep money in poverty alleviation because of their political interest. Naturally, they would want to pander to areas where you have a lot of people in poverty, and naturally they won't take money away from that. So if this policy comes into play, right, majority of the time what we anticipate is that they will take money from, let's say, tax breaks to corporations or possibly other things that they are funding, right? So this false comparative simply cannot fly in this debate. But the second thing what we would say is that this idea of the policy of forwarding underprivileged backgrounds is something that is actually a program that has existed in a lot of developing countries, but I will tell you why this model has not worked. Number one, the improvements did not happen because they presume that just by providing daycare, just by providing these educational institutions, even funneling as many resources as you can, naturally you cannot still change the incentive mechanisms of these parents who are poorly educated. Why? Firstly, with poor education, most likely these countries are areas where you have largely traditional values, where naturally they don't find value in sending their children to school, and they would rather send their children to, for example, work in farms or to work in their local communities, right? Because of these traditional values. But secondly, even the economic structures cannot be taken down just because you build a daycare in that particular area. This has happened in a lot of the conditional cash transfers that have existed in a lot of ASEAN countries, for example. The reason why it did not work is because even if they send their children to daycare centers, or even if they send their children to these educational centers, or even to healthcare centers, naturally, the economic structures still does not make it possible for them to create a child-rearing environment that is best for children. We agree. To some extent, we will shed a tear for the poor parents who possibly will not get the additional benefits. But this debate and a lot of states will have to make difficult choices. The question of the debate is not just about where do we allow as many people as we can to have children, but more importantly, where do we create a better environment for children to grow up in. We say that their model does not do that exactly, and that's why we don't find value in that model. So even if we take them at their best case, right, we say that even in the allocation of money, we are better in the comparative. The simple reason is because on our side, what we believe is that when parents already have children, that's when they naturally find the incentive to actually care for these children, to spend on them. It's an inexplicable notion, panel, right? Sometimes when you see your child, like this idea of motherhood, when you see your child and you just want to care for that being out of instinct, it's something that's important. And we say that once this happens, these parents will naturally spend on their children, and they have the capacity to do so. In the comparative on opposition, right, what happens is you create this environment when the state naturally has to keep on spending and spending and spending for all of these all of these people in poverty who cannot afford their education, right? We say that in our world, when you incentivize these highly educated individuals to have their children, there are two benefits that they never responded to. Number one, we told you that the state interest is the next generation that we are building is capable of getting more income for the state, and that means that you can have more money to actually funnel into the programs that opposition wanted. But number two, even in the short term, the fact that all the opposition, all the government has to focus on are people in poverty means that they don't have to cater to other children out there who they still have to open opportunities for. So in terms of state interest, right, what they have yet to respond to in this debate are two things, right? Number one, it's the wealth and financial stability that comes with having children who come from highly educated backgrounds. Second, the fact that they naturally make better political choices because of the degree of information that they have. Those are state interests that are largely imperative in this debate. Second, let's go to child rearing, right? Because this is something that they didn't really consider much, right? We say that firstly, when it comes to child rearing, we cannot buy into the rhetoric anymore that the highly educated individuals basically are shackled into entering this particular choice. The first is because if you notice, currently, if anything, the discrimination is in reverse. Because in highly educated environments, people don't really see a value to rearing children. The simple reason is because majority of the incentives that come with having children are mostly traditional values that are shaped by culture and norms that highly educated people are able to escape from because of their academic background or their vastly different experiences. Which means that when you're part of the academe or even part of if you have a high job in a corporation, for example, your natural incentive mechanisms is not to take a child or to have a child because naturally there are lots of opportunity costs with having that child to begin with. So if anything, the choices of parents in status quo are skewed against having children. And that's why we talked to you about the idea that we need to equalize this playing field and have the high incentives for these individuals to have children in order for them to access that choice to begin with, right? And more importantly, the reason why this incentive has to exist is because, in all honesty, it is just better for highly educated individuals for child rearing. Firstly, we say that child rearing has become more complicated in the world today, right? But before I move on to that, yes.
Would you support higher tax rates on the disabled, according to all of your logic?
Why would we support higher tax rates for disabled? I think we can provide support for them if that's the case. But this debate is specifically about what kinds of next generations do we want to build. So now, when it comes to child rearing, right, we say that children need a wider array of choices in order for them to maximize their opportunities. And majority of the time, this is not accessed by people, this is not accessed by children who are born into to parents who do not have a high educational background, right? As I said a while ago, in majority of states, most of the people who come from poorly educated backgrounds are those who utilize traditional methods when it comes to rearing their children. This comes in the form of telling your child that in the future you have to go back to the family and help out for your siblings or to help out and provide for the family, right? Or second, the fact that these are parents who rear their children to be in this largely traditional environment that is purely religious. And we think that that locks children in these particular choices and it makes it harder for them in the future to access different opportunities. We say that in highly educated environments, children are much better off because these children are presented with a wider array of opportunities because of the intellect that comes with their parents. And we say that that is a better environment for child rearing. And more importantly, we say that the state has an interest in this, and that's why we're very proud to propose. Thanks.
Two points. First of all, why this is detrimental to equality of women within society. Second of all, why this leads to worse life for these children. Before that, quite a lot of rebuttal. First, this debate is obviously about allocation of resources. This is clear from the point where Grafi says we are also supportive of child benefits, just either equal or even progressive child benefits. Well, what they are proposing is regressive child benefits, where the people who have the most money get the most out of the state for the child support, the people who need it the least. Now, their response to this is saying, oh, but there is always more money for poverty alleviation, right? Three reasons, three answers. First of all, obviously there's not enough money in poverty alleviation because obviously many problems still exist. Welfare is underfunded, healthcare for poor people is underfunded. We just don't accept a perfect world in which we can always do both. Note that exactly the problems that they are talking about within poor communities that say, oh, we've poured so much money and nothing has happened, can easily be solved by having slightly more incentivizing. For example, when they're talking about people bringing children sending them to work in farms, we're saying access to nearby education plus a minimal incentive, financial incentive that makes it as profitable for you to have that child sent to school as it would be for him to work on the farm, which is quite little economic investment would solve the problem that they're talking about. That means more money there is much, much more effective. Second of all, they say, oh, we'll just raise corporate taxes. Magical solution, right? No, that is the tax that's most detrimental to growth within countries. You can't just we'll raise taxes and we don't know what the effects will be. That is insane. Thirdly, just in terms of how debates work, if they have the fiat to have significantly more money poured into a specific field, we have the exact same fiat to pour exactly the same amount of additional money that they're giving to something else that we believe it will be more effective there. Then they tell us, there are two advantages in rich parents. One is they make better political choices. The other one is they can give their child a better life. What political choices? That sounds horrible to us. That the state can literally has the legitimacy to rear the sort of voters that it wants and to incentivize people who make the political choices that the government supports. That sounds like a horrible place for abuse. But moreover, let's talk about the actual issue. Rich parents can provide a better life for their children. First of all, assumingly, poor people do not stop bringing children as a result of this motion. Therefore, the likely scenario is all the things they have said about, because there are cultural reasons, because there are religious reasons, all the things open government themselves finalize. Why is this important? Because this means that all the children that they're talking about, who they acknowledge are not getting the best life today, are getting a worse life on their side of the house. We believe that is terrible and it starts significantly more children just because in most countries we have more poor people than very rich, highly educated people. Secondly, Rafi explains to us that the most important thing for a child is parental attention. We're saying that specifically, rich, highly educated parents are likely, again by open government's own analysis, to have less time to spend with their children. They have demanding careers, even if they have that half year when they're at home and that year they're at home because of the benefits, they are still going to at some point have significantly less time to spend with their child. And we believe by the analysis we provided, that leads to worse life. Thirdly, Rafi also explains to you that this program might over-incentivize people in the sense that it literally brings them to have children when they're not ready for it. We're saying that at the point where rich people choose not to have children because their career is more important to them, given that they have the financial ability to do so, that might actually be quite a good litmus test for who is a good parent, good enough parent, and who isn't. And we're saying if what you want is a great life for children, that is better on our side. I think that covers it. Yes, sir.
Given the sort of incentives that we're talking about are financial incentives, as opposed to the daycare centers that you're talking about, who do you think this policy affects most?
First of all, obviously daycare centers are things that cost money, but we're not only talking about daycare centers, we are also talking about direct financial support to these parents. Who does this policy affect? I'm not sure I understand exactly what you're asking. Like, who does the policy we're implementing right now affects, or your policy affects? I think OG has been quite clear that they believe this affects highly educated parents to have more children, I don't know. Sorry. Okay, equality of women, why is it detrimental to it? One of the major things that allow women to progress within society, to have more high-paying jobs, to be CEOs, to enter politics, to enter these things, has been a wide decrease in childbirth rates within the Western world. Why is this the case? First of all, because there is a strong societal expectation, plus some biological factors also factor into this, like for example pregnancy and taking care of the baby. That mean women are expected to be the ones taking care of the child at the expense of their career and their education. Specifically, we're talking about women doing this at a formative point within their career, the time when young people gain training, gain education, gain the entry-level jobs that are very demanding, very hard to do, that would lead them to have the higher income later. I know what Sarah wants to say. If they have not gained education yet, how can they get this money? Obviously, we are talking a woman who has already done a master's degree and now needs to get the entry-level job and now needs to work as an intern for like 18 hours a day is the most crucial place where people gain that work education and are less able to do this now. Secondly, the expectation of employers that women are going to have maternity leaves is increased at the point where this is common among women from certain classes. Assuming this policy is effective in influencing the incentives of highly educated families, this sets us years and decades back in terms of the rights of women. Why? Because obviously we're not saying that women will not work at all, but first of all, because high ranking positions like CEOs, like a CEO partner in a company, like politicians, are things that are very hard to get to. We need a lot of women striving for the better women to get there. Secondly, in order to change the working environment within workplaces, we need women who are specific. We need a critical mass of women coming into these places and changing them, and not only having one woman in an all-boys club. So what we're saying here is that they are denying the ability to advance women within politics, within economics, through role models of strong successful women. All these things are detracting significantly on the other side of the house, which just leads to a worse society all in all. And we are very proud to oppose the motion for all these reasons.
Three things in this speech. So firstly, I'm going to clean up a lot of the discussion that happened in the opening half and address specifically this argument that it's simply too costly to do this and we're going to have to reallocate all of our resources from healthcare and from early start programs and that sort of stuff, and show why it doesn't apply in this debate. Then I'm going to get on to two aspects of extension. So the first is to really look at the societal benefits across time, how these benefits compound and how this is an incredibly efficient investment of government money. And then I'm going to talk about the nature of justice in this debate, because the opening government have outlined how people have access problems, particularly for women. We see that, and we're going to frame that as a problem of basic fairness and justice that the government has an obligation to try and deal with. So firstly, on expense, basically. The opening opposition told us, look, you always face choices based on cost. The comparative between this and between our policy is like early start programs and massive investment in education for poorer people. Well, firstly, we think generally that's not mutually exclusive. They tried to make it so by saying that our program will be so costly as to suck up funds that otherwise would be put there. We don't think that's the case. The second relevant difference to keep in mind is that their model doesn't incentivize higher birth rates. But why is it the case that it's not that expensive in terms of what we're going to do? Well, firstly, we think the financial incentives, and particularly the policy incentives we also support, like extending parental and maternal leave, don't have to be extremely expensive. Why? Well, for people who are already very, very wealthy, the reason why they're deciding not to have children is not related to their financial status. So we don't need to provide huge payments to try and convince those people. We're not going to give them $100,000 a year or something to bribe them into having children, because they're comfortable as it is and they've made other reasons not to have children. If those other reasons include things like not being able to access parental leave or being discriminated against in the workplace, the policies that we support will encourage those people to have children. Although, the people who will be encouraged to have children are educated people for whom financial incentives are a very important thing. So typically that's going to be your lower middle class educated people who've made the choice to enter into comparatively underpaid but very educated professions, like teachers, like nurses, like people in caring professions. Why? Because those are the people for whom the financial outcomes are particularly important. So the payments need to be targeted at a level that encourages them by easing that financial burden. That's not $100,000 a year. That's not hugely expensive. We think that core target group are able to be affected without that. So we can reject, firstly, this claim based on their idea that in order to incentivize very wealthy people, you have to pay them a lot. That means that there's a lot more money freed up to target, the early start programs that they would want to talk about. But secondly, they did say a lot of the things they were pursuing were comparatively cheap. So, investing more in daycare centers and those things. So we don't see why it's necessarily mutually exclusive to do both of these if the investment in a financial terms from our side is not massive, and if the investment from theirs is not massive either. So at that stage, I think we can reject this idea that it simply costs too much money to do this. And immediately, a lot of the opposition's case falls away, because most of their qualms were about the opportunity cost rather than about this being an inherently bad policy. So let's talk about why this is a good policy. So we want to start first with the government's interests and motivations in terms of societal benefits. We think the government has an active interest in promoting outcomes, so not just promoting a playing field for everybody, but recognizing that it's got an active interest in the happiness and the health and the wealth of that society. We think this is an important way to overcome a current problem. That problem is low birth rates, particularly amongst educated people. And why do these people make better parents? So firstly, we think there's a general correlation there because they typically invest more time in their own children, but particularly they invest more time in their own children's education. So educated people often value that, often intellectually push their own children and encourage their own children to become educated. So some of this material was covered in the opening government, but what they then didn't talk about was the fact that the effects of this are going to be quite wide. So those children themselves will often go on to be educated. They'll be empowered to make the choice about where they want to where they want to end up working, especially if they have the choice to become a teacher because they know they don't have to become a fancy lawyer to have children themselves. But secondly, we think that has an effect on industries and investment, right? So we think more people more people engaging, educated people engaging in university means that you often have increases in wealth and increases in social progress and those kind of things. We think the impact of that across time is particularly large. Why? Because we think that it tends to exponentially increase, right? So if you have more educated, well-adjusted children growing up and working in those fields, the sort of societal benefit that they bring will tend to increase, and then their children as well. So across time, we think the impact is huge. Let's move on now to a secondary point about the nature of justice. So we think, firstly, that everybody ought to have the right to access having children. Right? We think having children is important and a part of a core human experience, and it can be a centerpiece of life. And we think that there's a certain class of people who are affected by this. So that typically is people who need to make who choose not to have children for reasons of their career and those sorts of things. So typically we're talking here about women who would otherwise be discriminated against in the workplace. So educated people who fit into that category have no ability to access that. And we think it's a matter of justice because often it's the social structures that have otherwise caused that, right? So it's not necessarily true that women should be the ones staying at home, but the current social structures often mean that women either have to make the choice between having a career or having a child. So at the point where you specifically target that group and say we're going to make it financially possible for you to do so, so we're going to compensate you for the comparative loss of earnings, but secondly we're going to have increased policies for you like maternity leave or encouraging paternity leave, that evens out that core unfairness. So that addresses a basic problem of justice in the current structures. What was the kind of in this milieu, there was a sort of a point from opening opposition about setting back the rights of women, right? And I'm happy to take a POI for, okay, we're not anymore, sorry. It's setting us back in terms of the rights of women. So basically saying that when women start having children, fewer women succeed. But the problem is, that's exactly the attitude that they're reinforcing. So their ideal world is fewer educated women have children, because by their logic, having children is the thing that stops you going into the workplace. What we're actually doing is evening that out. So we're giving people more generous policies, we're giving more people more generous compensation, which means that you can have a child and go back into a career, and it's much less of an issue for you. So if we have these robust ways to compensate, then you start to undermine all of those things. So it's not an argument in this debate to say that women shouldn't have children, because then they don't end up going into careers and they don't end up becoming role models. We think people should be empowered to have the choice, firstly, for an educated person to choose a lower paid career and still be able to have children, so to choose to be a teacher and still be able to afford it. But secondly, the ability to choose to have a child when you otherwise might not have been able to afford it. And particularly that question of justice, we think, is important for women. For those reasons, we are proud to propose.
I'm going to extend on actually the purpose of this policy and why we don't think that we would benefit society as a whole, which is the main goal of all governmental teams, not through the mutual exclusivity, but through direct harms of this policy. I'm going to show you why this incentivizes the wrong people who would not have solidarity for society to have kids, and why this would enlarge the gaps in society, and why those kids would not be of benefit to the state in the future as well, and why we'd have more negative outcomes. Before that, quick points of rebuttal. So first of all, about the point of the rich people make better parents. Look, they might make good parents. Good parenting is something that is hard to assess. It can be simply motherly love, and we say that many people like their parents and think they did a good job. But what we say is more critical. You can be a good parent to your child, and yet this would not mean that you would benefit society as a whole, and this they never prove in their case. Their second point about they just say we want more educated people, right? And you can do that in other ways. You don't necessarily need them to have more kids. But then they give you the point about fairness and the commitment of the state. Notice that this is uncomparative to everyone's alternatives of simply helping everyone who faces the dilemma of being a woman, making choices between bearing kids and not. Notice that these dilemmas also apply to poor women and also to poor people, or not to poor people, to people who are uneducated but have a high school diploma and become plumbers or become firemen. We don't understand why they need to target this group in the name of fairness. And once again, they don't prove that. Now, let's talk about the idea of who gets this incentive. So first of all, notice that OO starts saying that more privileged people are going to get that. But who are they likely to be? They are likely to be people of a certain background themselves, people who, as more education you have, probably you have better parents or you have more money to send you to a very good college to begin with. This is also very likely to correlate with certain ethnicities or the majority of that country, or with people who already are stronger. Now we say that these people, we can accept that these could even be the middle classes, but they are not only because of the tax breaks. But we say that those people tend often to be libertarian and more remote from society. Why is that? Because especially if you are a self-made person, just like CG wants to describe, you have overcome extraneous hardships in your life. Probably you have been bullied a lot because you wanted to study while your peers didn't want to do so. You had to work extremely hard to finance yourself through life, to have several jobs at a time. You had to overcome an environment that didn't want to encourage you. And we say that often this creates a feeling of a resentment towards society. Society did not want me to succeed, and yet I've made it anyway. Moreover, they feel that while they have worked hard, other people slacked around them. Other people remained poor even though they could have had the chance. Other people drank while they worked hard and didn't play football but worked in order to help their parents with the family business in order to get more money to fund them through college and so on. We say that this tends to create a situation where they view negatively the poor in society. Moreover, now they get an official confirmation to those feelings that they already have. And we say that this applies already to negative and classist feelings that exist. Now we say that fueled by this, they are likely to feel even more entitled. They would feel that they receive the money because they are indeed better than the other people in society, and those that don't receive that money are likely to. Now, why would they know that? Because in order to campaign for something like that, the government has to actually have ads, needs to target those people, needs to tell them we are doing it for the benefit of society, we need you, and so on. And this creates even less social solidarity, because they tend to think that they have gained something because of them and they don't need to give anything back to society. And we would see more propagation and more politicians even riding on this platform saying that this correlates to the fact and we need to give less to the poor all in all. Secondly, we say that exactly those couples that would have two academics, because if you want to get more money, especially if you're greedy, you would tend to find someone from your Ivy League and not necessarily marry someone from a different population and so on, because if they say that money matters to them so much, they would want to maximize the money, especially if they are as selfish and would see this as an opportunity to become even higher in class. So we would have those two parents that are highly academic, that are self-entitled, that would now bring this child into the world. Now we say that they would want to give this child the best that they have. They would want that child not to suffer as they did, or at least to live in a protected environment. We say that this is more likely to end up in them raising the child in a golden cage, in which he would not be exposed to all of the hardships that they have seen. He would be more isolated from everyone else. He would go to a different school. He would get get better opportunities in order for him not to slack behind. And he would constantly be reminded, just like we see with China and the one-child policy, that he's the best, he should excel, and so on. Now we are creating a child that has no connection to others, does not see the benefits that society has given him, but is more likely to only pursue his self-interest. Before I continue, Paul.
How do you address the core basic problem of justice when people otherwise choose not to have a future child because of the financial issues or the inability to?
So, A, we say give to everyone. But also, we don't think that this is such a huge problem. We see it in France. France subsidizes daycare for everyone. It's not such a huge problem because we see there are more and more women going to work. Now, we say that those kids would have a higher education, but this doesn't necessarily benefit society. Why? Because they would think of their self-interest. They are very likely to go abroad and work there where they have more opportunities and not feeling that they need to stay behind. Moreover, OG tells us that only the poor encourage you to give back to society, and they want to release them from the chains of trying to help anyone else. We say that this is exactly a bad thing, because if you are a country that wants to develop through its people and through its human resource, you do need them to help others. We say that this is especially important, unlike the comparative where you have more of those traditional chains of people trying to help, and this is something that would benefit the lower classes in the developed world, and in the developing world as well, those who need it much more. For all of those reasons, oppose.
Three areas of clash in this debate. First, let's talk a bit about the comparative and what we're affecting and what is the alternative, because that ends up being a quite important part of this debate. Secondly, let's talk about who raises children better, because that's what I think in terms of time most people have talked about. And lastly, we're going to talk about the broad societal impacts, because at least some of the teams claim that this is the most important thing in the debate. Let's start with the comparative. So opening opposition start this debate with a counterprop that says, look, we'll give everyone daycares and put all this money into poverty alleviation. We support daycares, we think that in general is a good thing. But opening opposition know that kind of starving African children is not a good argument in debate. Even though that is the most effective thing you could do, everyone donate to Against Malaria Foundation, that is the most important thing you can do. But that doesn't work in debating, right? And that's why they have the argument that says, look, but this is the same policy area, right? It's the same thing of like helping people with raising their children. I think they're wrong about that. They're wrong especially because of the argumentation you heard throughout this debate. Because poverty alleviation comes from caring for the poor. And they're right, that there is a limited amount of political will for that. No, thank you. But exactly due to all of the arguments you heard throughout this debate, this policy is not about caring for the poor. It is about improving education, improving the long-term influence of our country and so on. This is why we think it doesn't come from the same political will, and we don't have that trade-off that they're trying to achieve. Next, move on to the next trick that oppositions try to do, and this is throughout the opposition bench. So if you'll note, all of the analysis we get from oppositions tends to be about the rich versus the poor, those who have it all and those who face adversity. And opening government kind of fall in this trap. Their argumentation is sometimes about education and sometimes about rich and poor. Note, we recognize that being rich correlates with being highly educated. That's absolutely fine. The interesting point here is that we are offering financial incentives or their equivalent. This is important because that creates an enormously strong correlation to the other side. It is true that if we support by $100 a month, $500 a month, $1,000 a month, we will be giving those dollars also to ultra-rich people. But it is also true that this policy just simply does not affect them. The people who are affected by this policy are the people who are least financially well off. And of course, it's not a binary, but the less financially well off you are, the more you are affected by this policy. This is incredibly important because this means that a lot of the argumentation you've heard from both sides, and this is the clarification that Paul gives you in the POI that I tried to give opening opposition previously. What we are focusing here by using a financial incentive that is giving only to educated people is that we, in fact, incentivize educated people who are less financially well off. We think there are principled reasons to do this. We think there are practical reasons to do this. Finally, one last point on the comparative before I actually dive into the arguments. We heard some arguments about eugenics and state legitimacy throughout this case. Note that these arguments are relevant as a counterpoint to the political case of changing how people vote, and so on. Note that they are irrelevant to the vast majority of this debate, which talked about how to either give better lives for the children or create better societal impacts, because both sides on this debate want to prioritize money in a way that will improve the lives of children and have better societal impact. So we don't buy those lines of argumentation, at least not as relevant to most of the cases brought here, and specifically in closing. Let's talk about who raises children better. So opening government tells us that they rear children better, for kind of, they have more opportunities, there's more opportunity cost, and so on. Opening opposition attacked this with one major line of argumentation, and that is, it is actually those who are less well off who will give the most attention. They have proven that they want children the most, and they, and I quote, think this is the most important thing in parental choice. Paul deals with that in two ways. One is the clarification I've already given you. The fact that we recognize that having these financial incentives, and not only daycare centers, but actual tax breaks and financial incentives, which means that inherently these kinds of policies already focus on the poor. But importantly and crucially, he also gives you unique barriers to people who have had high education. Why? Because for the careers that they have options to, these are careers that expect them to work much harder and longer hours. These are people who have already spent possibly decades of their lives with no income trying to get that career. They are often have tons of student debt. These are illegitimate, and note, if they had tons of student debt and now became famous lawyers and make millions of dollars, they're not affected by this policy. But if they have tons of student debt and have high education, and these incentives of $1,000 a month are influential, this means these are people who have an enormous amount of barriers, right? So just to clarify, no thank you, what Paul shows you is that the people who have proven the most how much they are willing to sacrifice and how much they are willing to work and need these policies the most are those who are both educated and have low income, the people who are actually incentivized by this policy. Let's move on to broad societal impacts, but first, opening.
Yeah, so first of all, we obviously did not talk about poverty alleviation, but about helping poor parents more. But OG's mechanism included not only direct money transfers and huge tax breaks, but also even flights abroad. You cannot run away from that by just saying we will support poor PhDs by I'm not sure what it means. Great.
The extra money for flights abroad is wasted money. Fine. If you want to win the debate on that, everything else we said is important, and that is the core of the case of OG's case as well. They don't make it on flights abroad. Okay, moving on. Let's talk about broad societal impacts. So opening opposition talk mainly about the effect on women. They say, look, it's bad for women, they stay at home. Several responses to this. One, we just reject this idea that improving one of the options that women have is a bad and a crime against women. We think women have it pretty bad either way, whether they stay at home and face criticism or go to the job. Making one of them better and giving them more money and one of those sides, possibly you were okay with giving them more at both, is not, no thank you, a harm in this debate. Secondly, note that since we're talking about only women who have higher education, they have to concede that we're also, if this affects women and their decision making, they have to concede we're also influence women to get more high education. And come on, obviously the more important part is making sure that women actually go on to higher education rather than making sure that those women have already been to higher education and so on, then don't choose to have children, because that is the real harm of sexism. I feel that's an odd case to make. Note, however, that what Paul gives you is very strong and effects in the long term. Note that educated people, and note this doesn't rely on them being rich, educated people with attention to their children who have proven that it is important to them and need the money tend to educate much better. They can support their children's education, they can understand it, they think that education is important, and so on. Now, closing opposition say, look, but they won't help others. Note that we have already won that. All of closing opposition's analysis depends on them not facing adversity. The only way this incentive is influential on people's decision is if they currently face financial incentive. The fact that they cannot make money or lie on their, or use their money, parents' finances to get along anyway, means necessarily the people impacted by this motion are not the people who have never faced adversity. We think their case falls. We think it's important that those people who have faced adversity and have a higher education can rear better children, and that's super important in the long run. We beg you to propose.
Okay, so here's how it went down. OG set their metric in the outset to be the improvement of society. They name it sovereignty, but it becomes quite clear pretty early on that they actually mean the improvement of society. And they say, listen,
rich people will be better parents because they're more financially stable, which is something that's like rehashed with nicer words and then in closing and with a little bit more analysis, and essentially that rich people will contribute to society. The educated will contribute to society because, well, we guess the educated are good. But OO come up and ask, but where will the money come from? To which OG reply, you know, it doesn't really seem to be that expensive, doesn't seem to be the same things, and we're for poverty alleviation, maybe take it from corporations. And CG reply, it's not that expensive anyway, and it's a debate, so we'll just get money trees, and also, like, crucially, it's not really from the same pool of political will. We personally think this argument is rather boring. We think this argument is not essential to the debate because it is logically preceded by the question of, is this policy even good? Does this policy even do more harm than good? A question on which many teams were significantly lacking in analysis, and we provided the best analysis in this debate. And why is that? Because to a large extent, both teams, in closing, including the one that didn't listen to us, assume that because a parent is rich, they will raise kids that will be beneficial to society. But only go so far, you'll hear about it, as showing that they will raise kids that will be beneficial to themselves, that will be educated, that will be profitable, that will maybe even be happy. But that is insufficient for the metric that both governments have set out to achieve from the outset, and the metric that is the only one that makes sense for governmental societal action, and the metric the only one that makes sense for a neutral observer, which is what we are in this debate, the only metric that makes sense. Now, here's the thing. First of all, about the extension, we get one answer, and it's not good. I'm sorry, because Sela did not seem to have listened at all. Sela says, our analysis depends on them having not faced adversity. Unfortunately, Monica's analysis, check your papers, half of it depends on them, yes, facing adversity. The fact that they have faced adversity breeds resentment towards a society which has victimized them and made them feel excluded, as many people in this room has felt because they are smart, because they pursue education, because they are not cool, because they are nerds, because they get bullied, they feel resentment towards that society. They don't look like, you know, some of the privileged do it, all of poor people, and say, oh, those people never even have a chance. They say, I am the living proof that those people had a chance, and these are all the people that didn't take it. To supplement that, we also add analysis on why even the rich behave, and even the educated people where both parents are rich behave in that way, because they will raise their children in a sheltered existence in the same way that they have, and therefore we win. But even if you don't accept that, their answer is not even true. I distinctly remember the words tax breaks being said in opening government. Tax breaks are just not a flat rate policy. So if those words were said, as I recall, it seems that the entire presumption, and like Sela goes to mention that this is incredibly important, and I agree to their extension, if that presumption doesn't hold because tax breaks are like proportionate to how much money you make, then, you know, the analysis doesn't really hold. We'll still think there's going to be enough money. And we still think it's logically proceeding whether the policy is even good to before what are the alternatives, because that's extremely hard to judge, assess, and what's like going to be the trade-off. I don't think one line from Ayala is enough to say that corporate shit is important more than this, whatever. Okay, so first of all, what sort of child do we get, and will they contribute to society? So OG say you're going to have financial stability, and CG say you're going to invest time and encourage your children to pursue education. But we are the first team to remind you, as we know, as we told you, that a happy or a successful child doesn't mean contribution to society. Monica does that on two levels. First, analyzing two distinct populations. Firstly, the sort of people CG want to talk about, the people who have made it out and dragged themselves up by the bootstraps. We say that, well, not all of them, right, because this is a characterization, but there are strong incentives for a majority of them to act in resentment against the societies who have victimized them, against exactly the societies they know they can emerge with. We recognize that there are like outliers to this, even though no one even bothered to answer with that answer. But fine, we recognize there are outliers to this, but we are the only team that analyzed the incentives of why, and the analysis of why there are fewer of them, and most people will actually have that resentment and that entitlement. Secondly, the idea that with the second population, the parents who are actually privileged themselves, we say they didn't face hardships, so they won't give their children, won't let their children face hardships. Wow, my phone just lost all its battery, so if anyone has time, they won't let their children face adversity, and they will keep them in a sheltered life. We say privilege often goes along with entitlement. Maybe debating is a bad proxy to that, but the way rich people correlate in voting everywhere, especially in Europe, is a good proxy to that. Just the fact that they feel entitled, they feel that they deserve what they've earned, and so therefore less solidarity, first of all, less solidarity in the policies that these children will pursue. Secondly, they'll move more abroad, which doesn't even benefit the country. And thirdly, the sort of professions that they choose are not necessarily beneficial to society, whether they're Wall Street bankers or what is that? Foreign policy advisors to third world, whatever. That's also like of limited beneficiality to that original country before that opening.
If self-made privileged parents are that harmful, are you then willing to discourage them from having children to begin with?
No, guys, we just don't think government should be in the business of meddling in who has children or not. And if you would have set that motion, we would have explained why distorting incentives for having children always turns out to be a bad idea. It's just that it's going to turn out to be a bad idea in different ways if you give that horrendous policy. Just let people decide and give them equal treatment. Now, how does that harm society? First of all, we say it strengthens this feeling that everybody got what they deserved, which erodes the social safety net and erodes erodes equal economic opportunities for people. Secondly, we say it also encourages sentiments against the immigrants, against the poor, against all those people who are perceived to be the ones that are not working hard enough, the ones which are leeches, the ones which have made it out. To this, we do have some analysis from OO which says eugenics. But note that only the analysis from Monica is what stands at the basis of that analysis. The fact that everybody has to be informed of the fact that they are the best because government has to advertise to this policy in order to actually change the incentives of parents to bring more children. So therefore, a crucial logical link in the face of that message argument, even if you buy into it to a very large extent, is the fact that they're going to be informed, and that link is exclusively provided by us in closing oppositions. For all those reasons, vote CO.